I don't care what your boarding pass says, I want you out of that seat. And I want you out of it now. Because a woman like you has absolutely no business sitting next to a man like me." The words landed in the first-class cabin of Royal Atlantic, Flight 771 to London. Heathrow, like a stone, dropped into still water, rippling outward in every direction until every conversation stopped. Every screen dimmed in peripheral vision. Every pair of eyes shifted toward row 1 without anyone quite willing to admit they were looking. The woman in seat 1B did not flinch. She did not look up. Her manicured fingers moved to the bottom corner of the page she was reading, a thick document stamped "Confidential" across the header in bold red letters, and she turned it with the same deliberate, unhurried patience she had used for every page before this one, as though the man looming over her in the aisle were simply a change in cabin pressure, something the body registered and then adjusted to without drama. What Warren Holt did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never in his 57 years considered that the world might contain women like this one, was that the document she was reading would within 48 hours be signed by the representatives of 54 nations in a ceremony at the London Guildhall, and that the reason this aircraft was legally permitted to leave American airspace. At all the reason Captain Roy Elkins held a valid commercial pilot certification. The reason Royal Atlantic's Heathrow landing slots had been renewed without interruption for the past 6 years was because of the signature of the woman in 1B. But that is where this story ends. To understand how we arrived here, how a man who believed the sky belonged to him boarded a plane that would never take him where he intended to go, we need to go back 2 hours to a curbside at JFK International Airport, where a black town car was idling in the departure lane, and a man named Warren Holt was already destroying someone's career before he had even stepped out of the vehicle. The call had started somewhere over the bridge and had not gone well for the person on the other end, though Warren Holt would have described it as going extremely well because the other person was now silent, which in Warren's experience meant they had understood their situation clearly. "I don't want an explanation." Bradley Warren said, his thumb pressed against the cold window of the town car as Manhattan's outer boroughs blurred past outside. "I want the analysis redone by the time I land in London, and I want it in Garamond, not whatever sans serif catastrophe you submitted this morning. That document went to 3 board members before I caught it. 3. Do you understand what you cost me in credibility? Clean it up or clean out your desk." He ended the call without waiting for a response and stepped out of the town car before Devon, his driver of 11 years, had fully brought it to a stop. Devon climbed out quickly, moving to the trunk to retrieve the single Louis Vuitton carry-on and the slim leather briefcase that Warren traveled with. He had learned long ago that Warren did not check bags, that Warren did not wait for anything, and that the most useful thing Devon could do was simply remain one step ahead of whatever Warren needed next, which was an exhausting way to spend a decade of your professional life, though Devon had never said so out loud. Mr. Holt, Devon said, catching up to Warren on the curb holding out the carry-on handle. "Before you go in, I wanted to mention something." Warren was already scanning the terminal entrance with the practiced eye of a man who had flown out of JFK over 200 times and knew exactly which lane moved fastest. "What?" "I was checking in the system this morning to confirm the booking," Devon said carefully, because he had learned that careful was the only speed that worked with Warren. "Royal Atlantic has a passenger flag on file for you from the March flight. The gate supervisor mentioned it when I called to arrange the lounge access. Apparently there was a complaint filed." Warren turned to look at Devon for the first time since getting out of the car, and Devon recognized the expression. Not anger, exactly, but the prelude to it, that particular tightening around the jaw that meant Warren was deciding whether this information was worth engaging with or worth dismissing, and Devon already knew which way it would go. "Someone filed a complaint because I asked to be reseated away from a crying infant," Warren said. "That's what passes for a formal complaint now. A man with a platinum card asking for basic comfort accommodations. It wasn't filed by the airline, Devon said. It was filed by the other passenger. Warren picked up his carry-on and turned toward the terminal. "Get the car washed while I'm gone," he said. "It smells like the air freshener you use." Devon stood on the curb and watched him go, and he had the specific feeling, the kind that arrives in the stomach, before it arrives in the mind, that something was going to happen on this trip that would be very difficult to clean up, and that, unlike the car, it would not simply be a matter of finding the right product and applying it. Warren moved through the priority security lane in just under 4 minutes, sliding his briefcase onto the belt without slowing his stride, collecting it on the other side, without breaking pace, nodding at nothing when the TSA agent said, "Have a good flight, sir," because the words were directed at his back, and Warren had already rounded the corner toward the Meridian Lounge, where the door scanner beeped green when he tapped his phone against it, and the agent who held it open said, "Welcome back, Mr. Holt," to a man who did not acknowledge she had spoken. The Meridian Lounge at JFK's Terminal 7 was the kind of place that existed to remind certain people that they were not like other people, and Warren Holt had been using it for long enough that he no longer noticed the leather chairs, the curated lighting, the wall of premium spirits arranged with gallery-like precision, or the attendant who materialized beside him with a glass of Macallan 18 the moment he settled into his usual corner seat, because these things had simply become the texture of his life, the wallpaper he moved through without seeing. He opened his phone and found the offending document, Bradley's analysis, 12 pages of sharp thinking wrapped in the wrong typeface, and composed a follow-up text that left no ambiguity about the consequences of a second mistake, then set his phone face down on the table and picked up the whiskey. And in that moment, between setting down the phone and lifting the glass, he was something almost like relaxed, which for Warren Holt meant the particular absence of active fury that other people might have called contentment. He genuinely believed in the private and unexamined center of himself that the standards he held people to were the reason he had built something worth holding standards. About that, the precision he demanded was what separated Holt Meridian Capital from the firms that had flamed out around him over the years, and that the people who called him difficult were simply people who had never been required to be excellent. And so they resented the requirement, the way a student resents a teacher who actually grades the work, and Warren had made peace with being resented, had in fact come to wear it as a kind of credential, the way certain men wear the calluses on their hands. He ordered a second whiskey by holding up the glass without looking at the server, and spent the remaining 40 minutes before boarding reviewing the London meeting agenda and mentally rehearsing the moment he would walk into the room and remind a collection of European investment bankers that the American market they wanted access to ran through him, and that running through him had a price, and the price was deference. And deference was something Warren had never had to ask for twice in his professional life. He was in a perfectly calibrated state of pre-meeting focus when the boarding announcement came, and he collected his things and walked to the gate and down the jet bridge with the same quality of movement he brought to every room. He entered the movement of a man who is not walking towards something, but rather arriving at something that has been waiting for him, which is a subtle distinction, but a real one. And it was the last uncomplicated thing Warren Holt would feel for a very long time. She had been sitting at gate 31 for 20 minutes. When it happened, a young black woman in a Royal Atlantic ground crew uniform, being stopped by a supervisor near the boarding desk, asked to show her ID badge, even though the badge was visibly clipped to her chest, asked again to confirm her employee number, even though it was printed on the badge, and then asked a third time about something Claudette could not hear from where she was sitting, but could read perfectly well from the expression on the young woman's face, which was the expression of someone who has been through this particular door enough times to know exactly where it leads, and has simply decided, as an act of survival, not to let it show. Claudette Beaumont watched this from her gate seat and felt something old and specific move through her chest. Not surprise, never surprise anymore, but the particular ache of recognition, the way you feel when you see something you have seen 1,000 times, and it still has not lost its capacity to land. She thought about her father. James Beaumont had been the best pilot in Pointe Coupee Parish, Louisiana, by the time he was 24 years old, which was a fact that everyone in the parish, white and black alike, acknowledged in the specific way people acknowledge things that are undeniably true, but that they would prefer not to discuss at length, because discussing it at length would require them to discuss what was done about it, which was nothing, and then to discuss why nothing was done, which led to conversations that made certain people uncomfortable in ways they had no vocabulary for. James had applied for a commercial pilot's license in 1971, and again in 1974, and again in 1977, and each time the application had been denied on procedural grounds that shifted just enough between rejections to prevent any single grounds from being challenged directly. A flight hours documentation issue, the first time a medical certification formatting question, the second time a licensing fee, processing delay, the third time each obstacle small enough to seem bureaucratic and innocent, each one landing in a pattern that only looked like a pattern if you were willing to look at it honestly, which the relevant authorities were not. James Beaumont had kept flying crop dusters across the Louisiana Delta until he was 59, when his knees made it too difficult to manage the rudder pedals for the extended periods required, and he had died at 61 in the spring of 1993, having never once flown a commercial route, having never once carried a paying passenger, having never once sat at the controls of an aircraft in the capacity his talent had earned him. And the night he died, Claudette, who was 23, and had just been accepted to Georgetown's public policy program, had sat in the kitchen of their small house outside New Roads and made herself a specific kind of promise that she had spent the next 24 years keeping. Her mother, Eleanor, had driven young Claudette to the Baton Rouge Metro Airport every Saturday morning, from the time Claudette was 6 until the time she was 12, and they would sit in the observation area with a thermos of sweet tea and watch the planes move across the tarmac, and Eleanor would say, in the particular tone she reserved for the truest things she knew, "The sky doesn't know what color you are, baby. Only the people on the ground do. And the ground is where small thinking lives." The document in Claudette's satchel, the London Accords on Passenger Dignity and Aviation Equity, 24 years in the making, bearing her name on the cover page as primary author and architect, was her answer to the ground and everything that lived on it. She had arrived at Gate 31 with 40 minutes to spare, which was her habit, not because she was anxious about missing flights, but because she was constitutionally opposed to rushing, having learned long ago that the people who rushed were usually the people who had not prepared, and Claudette Beaumont had been preparing for most things for most of her life. She carried a single leather document satchel and a small wheeled carry-on, both understated and expensive in the way that things are expensive, when they are built to last rather than built to signal. And she settled into a gate seat near the window and opened the Accords document and began reviewing the third section, which covered complaint resolution timelines, and which she had revised 11 times over the past 3 years to close a loophole that 2 major carriers had been quietly exploiting for the better part of a decade. When the pre-boarding announcement came, she collected her things and joined the line, and the gate agent, a young man with an eager, slightly overwhelmed quality, scanned her boarding pass, looked at his screen, and then looked at her. "Could I see that again, ma'am?" he said. She handed it back. He scanned it a second time, frowned at the screen, then looked at her again with the expression of someone who has found a result they were not expecting and is not sure what to do with it. "And do you have a photo? ID I could verify." She provided her passport. He looked at it, looked at her, looked at his screen. "One more moment," he said, and reached for his radio. Claudette stood quietly, her hands folded over her satchel strap, and she was aware in the way she was always aware of the 3 people behind her, in the boarding line, who were not being asked for secondary verification. And she was aware of the quality of the gate agent's uncertainty, which was not malicious. He was genuinely confused by something on his screen, but which landed the same way, regardless of its source. She was also aware of the flight attendant who was standing near the jet bridge door, doing pre-boarding checks, a woman in her mid-30s, black, with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of face that had learned to hold itself very still in professional settings. And this woman had been watching the exchange at the gate desk for the past 30 seconds, with an expression Claudette recognized immediately, the expression of someone witnessing something familiar and deciding whether or not this is the moment to say something about it. Their eyes met for 1 second. The flight attendant's name tag read, Denise. Neither woman spoke, neither needed to. The gate agent's radio crackled with a confirmation from the boarding supervisor, and his expression cleared. "Apologies for the delay, Dr. Beaumont," he said, handing back her passport with a slight flush of embarrassment. "You're all set. Enjoy your flight." She thanked him without emphasis and walked down the jet bridge, and when she reached 1B and settled in and opened her satchel and withdrew the Accords document, she thought for a moment about her father, the way she always did at the start of a long flight. And then she found her page and began to read. Claudette had flown first class on 4 continents over the past 12 years, and she had developed the kind of calibrated awareness that comes from repeatedly entering spaces where your presence is unexpected and sometimes unwelcome. Not a hypervigilance, exactly, more like a fine-tuned peripheral vision that registered the small social recalibrations happening around her without pulling her focus from whatever she was actually doing. She noticed the couple in 2A and 2B exchange a glance when she passed their row, a quick involuntary thing, the kind of look people give when something doesn't match the pattern they had assembled in their minds. And she noted it, the way you note a change in weather, not as a wound, not as a surprise, just as information about the climate she was moving through. The first-class cabin of Royal Atlantic Flight 771 was well appointed in the specific way of long-haul international cabins. All muted navy and warm brass lighting, with the particular hush of a space designed to make the people inside it feel insulated from the ordinary world. And Claudette had always found this quality slightly ironic, because the ordinary world had a way of following certain people into these spaces regardless of the thread count on the headrest covers. She was 20 minutes into the 3rd section of the Accords document, which was the section she found most technically satisfying and most emotionally significant, when she registered, without looking up, the change in the quality of movement at the front of the cabin that meant the last of the pre-boarding passengers was arriving. She heard him before she saw him, which was generally true of men like Warren Holt. There was a particular frequency to the way they moved through spaces that announced their presence ahead of their bodies. Something in the quality of the footsteps, the authority with which they displaced air. She registered him pausing behind the bulkhead. She registered the small sound of a carry-on handle being gripped more tightly. She registered the pause that went on a beat longer than normal, and then another beat, and then the specific quality of a silence that is not peaceful, but loaded. She turned a page. Warren Holt stood at the entrance to row 1, his Louis Vuitton carry-on in his right hand, and looked at the woman in 1B, at the cashmere blazer, the intricate braids, the gold-rimmed glasses, the thick document she was reading. And something moved across his face. That was not confusion, because he was not confused about what he was seeing, but rather a kind of rigid, settling resistance. The expression of a man encountering something he has decided in advance he will not accept. Claudette turned another page. She did not look up. Warren set his carry-on in the overhead bin, with more force than was necessary. The thud of it drawing a glance from the flight attendant named Denise, who was organizing service items in the galley, and who absorbed the sound with the practiced neutrality of someone who has heard that particular kind of controlled aggression enough times to know what usually follows it. He settled into 1A and spent approximately 45 seconds staring at the partition between his suite and Claudette's before he cleared his throat, a deliberate theatrical sound, the kind that is designed to communicate that someone is being inconsiderate by virtue of existing too close. Claudette did not respond. He cleared his throat again with slightly more emphasis, and when this also produced no reaction, he shifted in his seat and said in the tone of a man who is being extraordinarily patient with a situation that does not deserve his patience. "Excuse me." Claudette lowered the document an inch, looked at him over the rim of her glasses, and said, "Yes." One word. Unhurried. Polite in the specific way that is not warm. Warren said there appeared to have been a mistake with the seating arrangement, and Claudette said in under 8 words that 1B was the seat printed on her boarding pass. Warren said he was not questioning the boarding pass. He was questioning the arrangement, and specifically the arrangement as it pertained to his need for privacy, because he was a Platinum Legacy member who had specifically requested, had in fact demanded, when he booked, that the seat adjacent to his be kept unoccupied, or if that was not possible, that it be occupied by someone. And here he paused, and the word he chose next was compatible. Claudette set down the document completely. She turned to look at him fully, and her expression was the expression of a scientist who has just identified the species of something she has been studying for a long time. Compatible, she repeated, her voice carrying clearly to the galley where Denise had stopped moving entirely, her hand resting on the service cart without pushing it. Warren said he meant someone who understood the atmosphere of this cabin, the nature of the work he was conducting, the importance of discretion regarding sensitive business materials. And as he said all of this, his voice dropped into a confidential register that was clearly designed to suggest she was the only one who didn't understand something obvious that everyone else already knew. Claudette looked at him for 3 more seconds, then picked up the document and returned to her page. "I understand perfectly," she said, and turned the page. Thomas had been the purser on Royal Atlantic's transatlantic routes for 16 years, which meant he had navigated approximately 16 years' worth of entitled passengers. Delayed departures, medical emergencies, and interpersonal catastrophes at 35,000 feet. And he had developed the particular combination of genuine patience and granite firmness that this work required, in the way that a river develops its banks slowly under continuous pressure until the shape is simply part of the landscape. He was in the galley reviewing the meal service sequence when Warren Holt appeared at his elbow with the energy of a man who had already decided this conversation would end the way he wanted it to end. Warren told Thomas that the passenger in 1B needed to be reseated economy if nothing else was available, and that this was a comfort issue, a privacy issue, and at this point he was prepared to characterize it as a security issue because he had sensitive business documents that could not be reviewed in proximity to someone who had not been cleared for that level of information. And he said all of this quickly, and with the practiced fluency of a man who has made enough demands in enough boardrooms to have developed a very efficient delivery system for them. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting, then explained that the flight was fully booked, first-class business and economy, that Dr. Beaumont held a valid ticket for 1B, and that there was no procedure by which a passenger could be reseated against their will at the request of an adjacent passenger who had not been physically threatened. Warren said he was a Platinum Legacy member with over 1 million miles on Royal Atlantic, and Thomas said he appreciated that, and it made no difference to the policy. Warren said he personally knew the airline's VP of operations, a man named Gerald Ashworth, and Thomas said that was wonderful, and it still made no difference to the policy. Warren leaned in and told Thomas in a very specific and personal way that he would be making a call when this flight landed that would result in Thomas no longer working for this airline, and that he should consider carefully whether protecting the comfort of one passenger was worth that outcome. And Thomas's face did something very controlled and deliberate during this speech, which was to become completely still, the way a surface becomes still when all the heat has been removed from it. "I'm going to ask you to take your seat." "Mr. Holt," Thomas said, his voice dropping to the register of someone who has decided that the pleasantries are finished. "If you are unable to do that, I will need to take further steps." Warren said that was fine, that he would handle this himself, and turned back toward row 1. Thomas watched him go and reached for the interphone handset on the galley wall. Warren returned to row 1 and stood in the aisle beside 1B and did not sit down. And this was a deliberate choice because standing over someone is a form of argument. And Warren had learned early in his career that physical positioning communicated things that words alone could not. And he had used this understanding to great effect in many rooms over many decades. And the fact that the person he was deploying it against was sitting in an airplane seat, reading a regulatory document apparently without any awareness that she was supposed to feel diminished by his proximity, did not immediately register with him as a problem. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice was louder now, loud enough that the retired surgeon in 2A Dr. Franklin Webb, who had been reviewing patient charts on his laptop, looked up and reached for his phone with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who has decided to document something. Warren said he didn't know who she had talked to or what program had put her in that seat, but that she was making him uncomfortable, that he had a meeting in London tomorrow, worth more money than she had probably ever seen. That first-class cabins existed for the conduct of serious business by serious people, and that her presence, he gestured at her in a way that encompassed everything. The braids, the document, the glasses, the cashmere blazer was not appropriate for this environment. A woman in 3A audibly drew in her breath. Warren was not finished. He said he had flown this route 26 times and had never had to share his row with someone who clearly did not belong in it, and that the airline had some explaining to do about how its standards had deteriorated to the point where this was permitted, and the words that followed the words about what first class was supposed to provide relief from about what he had expected to get away from by buying the most expensive seat on the aircraft were not quite complete. But they did not need to be complete to communicate everything, because language of this specific shape aimed at a person of this specific description is a sentence that finishes itself. Dr. Webb in 2A was filming openly. Now his phone held steadily at the level of his chest, and 2 other passengers had their phones out, and Denise had come out of the galley and stopped 4 feet from Warren, and the cabin had gone so quiet that the hum of the engines felt like something you could reach out and touch. Claudette Beaumont placed a bookmark in the Accords document with the same quiet precision she brought to everything closed. It set it on the seat beside her and took off her glasses. She folded them. She set them down. When she spoke, her voice was not raised. It was lowered, which was different, the drop in volume that signals that someone has stopped trying to be understood and has started simply stating facts. She stood, and she was not tall, and it did not matter, because there is a kind of stillness that takes up more space than height does, and Claudette Beaumont possessed it absolutely. She said with the same tone she used in regulatory hearings when she was citing binding authority that what Warren Holt had just done, what he had just said in this cabin in front of these witnesses with phones recording, constituted a violation of federal aviation regulation. Part 121, specifically the provisions governing interference with passengers and cabin environment, and that she was formally notifying the crew of this violation, which triggered a mandatory captain review before any departure could proceed. Warren told her not to quote regulations at him, that he had lawyers who wrote regulations that she had absolutely no standing to. Thomas stepped between them from behind smoothly, with the physical precision of someone who has had to place themselves between two people before and knows exactly how much space is required and how to occupy it. And he put one hand up. Not touching Warren just present a boundary made physical, and said with great quiet that Mr. Holt needed to step back now. Warren did not step back. He slammed his open hand against the overhead bin above Claudette's seat, and the sound rang through the cabin like something breaking, and several passengers flinched, and Denise did not flinch, because Denise had been expecting something like this since the moment she'd watched Warren grip that carry-on handle on the jet bridge. Claudette looked at Thomas. Her voice was even and clear and carried to every corner of the first-class cabin. "Thomas," she said, "I believe this passenger constitutes a safety risk. The captain cannot legally depart with a physically aggressive, non-compliant passenger on board. I'd like you to notify Captain Elkins." Warren laughed a hard, dismissive sound. "The captain," he said. "You think the captain is going to listen to you?" Claudette put her glasses back on and looked at Warren Holt for one long, steady moment. "Ask him," she said. The cockpit door opened with a sound that cut through the cabin tension, the way a judge's gavel cuts through a crowded courtroom. Not loud exactly, but with an authority that reorganized the entire space around it. Captain Roy Elkins was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with 4 gold stripes on his epaulets, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades being responsible for the lives of everyone around them. Every gesture deliberate. Nothing wasted the opposite of performance. He stepped into the cabin with the expression of a man who has been informed of a problem and is here to resolve it. And the mild annoyance visible in his face was directed not at any person, but at the situation, because they were losing their departure slot, and Roy Elkins did not lose departure slots. Warren stepped forward immediately, inserting himself between the captain and the rest of the cabin, with the practiced confidence of someone who has spent a career controlling which information reached which rooms in which order. And he began his version of events efficiently, smoothly, with the polish of a man who has learned to shape narratives under pressure, painting himself as the reasonable party, the one seeking only to protect the integrity of the cabin environment, the one who had been inexplicably failed by every crew member he had spoken to. Captain Elkins listened to this for approximately 12 seconds. Then he looked past Warren's shoulder, and what happened to his face? In that moment, the specific quality of the change was not warmth, exactly, not familiarity, exactly, but the particular alertness of someone who has suddenly understood that the situation they walked into is considerably different from the situation they were briefed on. "Dr. Beaumont," the captain said. The name landed in the cabin like a different kind of stone, not the stone Warren had dropped, which had made noise and caused ripples, but the kind that simply rests on the bottom and changes the landscape permanently. Warren turned. He looked at Claudette. He looked at the captain. You know her." Elkins had already moved past Warren, as though Warren were a piece of luggage someone had left in the aisle, and he addressed Claudette directly, with a quality of respect that was professional and very clearly genuine. And she told him briefly, and without drama, what had occurred in the last 20 minutes. And he listened the way people listen when they know they are receiving a formal account that will be documented. Warren Holt had built his career on the understanding that most problems, if you applied the right pressure to the right person at the right moment, would simply cease to be problems. And the right person in this situation was Gerald Ashworth, CEO of Royal Atlantic Airlines, whose private number Warren had obtained 3 years ago at an aviation industry gala in Chicago, and had never actually called, but had kept in his contacts as a kind of insurance policy, the way you keep certain things. Not because you expect to need them, but because having them makes you feel like the kind of person who would never need them. He pulled out his phone with a deliberate, visible gesture, the kind that is designed to be noticed by everyone in the vicinity, and announced to the cabin at large that he was calling Gerald Ashworth directly right now, and that Captain Elkins and this crew and this passenger were about to have a very educational conversation about what happened when you made an enemy of the wrong person. He dialed. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Warren did not acknowledge this outcome. He waited for the tone and then delivered his message loudly with the names of everyone involved, with the figure of $50 million, mentioned in connection with tomorrow's London meeting, with the words, affirmative action used twice, and incompetent used 3 times, and hung up and looked around the cabin with the expression of a man who has just placed a chess piece that guarantees checkmate in 3 moves. He'll call back in 5 minutes, Warren said to no one in particular, and when he does, you're all going to understand exactly what kind of mistake you've made tonight. Claudette Beaumont reached into her leather document satchel and withdrew a phone that was not like any phone Warren had seen in a personal capacity. Matte black, heavy with the kind of reinforced casing that suggests it was built to function in environments where commercial devices fail, the kind of phone that government agencies and regulatory bodies issue to people whose calls cannot be intercepted and whose communications cannot be disrupted by altitude or distance. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Warren. "I'll save him the time," she said. She dialed a number without consulting a contact list, which meant she had it memorized, which Warren registered with the first flicker of something that was not quite fear, but was in the general neighborhood. The call connected on the second ring. "Gerald," she said, her voice carrying the same quality it had held throughout this entire encounter level, unhurried, precise. "It's Claudette Beaumont. I'm calling from Royal Atlantic 771. We haven't pushed back yet. We have a situation." A pause. "A passenger named Warren Holt. He's filed complaints on 2 prior flights. Tonight he made a physical threat against a crew member, used racial language in the cabin, and is refusing to comply with captain's orders." Another pause, shorter. "Yes, he left you a voicemail about it approximately 90 seconds ago. He described me as an affirmative action hire." She looked at Warren with the detached attention of someone taking notes. "He does say he knows you. Would you like to speak with him?" Warren's mouth had opened sometime during this conversation and had not closed. Claudette extended the satellite phone across the aisle, holding it steady, her expression entirely neutral. The cabin was so quiet that several passengers reported afterward. They could hear the sound of breathing on the other end of the line. Warren took the phone. He held it to his ear. "Gerald," he said, and the word came out with a quality it had not had 60 seconds ago, thinner, smaller, with less air in it. What came back was not Gerald Ashworth's charity gala voice. It was Gerald Ashworth's insurance review voice, the voice of a man looking at a document that is telling him something he very much does not want to be told, and processing what it means for everything else. Gerald said Warren's full name, and then Gerald said that he was on speakerphone, and Warren looked at Claudette, who nodded once. Gerald said, and his words carried clearly to Dr. Franklin Webb in 2A, who was still filming, that Dr. Claudette Beaumont was the newly appointed chairwoman of the International Civil Aviation Oversight Board, that she was personally responsible for the renewal of Royal Atlantic's Heathrow landing slots, that she oversaw the certification of every commercial pilot operating in U.S. airspace, that she had a direct line to the FAA administrator that Gerald himself could not match, and that Warren Holt had spent the last 30 minutes apparently attempting to remove this woman from an aircraft because of the color of her skin. There was a silence. Warren turned his back to the cabin, which was not enough distance from 50 pairs of ears. He tried to apologize. He tried to explain. He tried to reframe what had happened as a misunderstanding, as a comfort request that had been misinterpreted as a situation that had spiraled beyond his intention. And Gerald Ashworth listened to all of it for approximately 15 seconds, and then told him to hand the phone back, collect his bag, and get off the plane, and that if he did not do so immediately, Gerald would have the Port Authority police board the aircraft to assist him. Warren lowered the satellite phone. He held it out to Claudette without looking at her. She took it, slid it back into her satchel, opened her document, and found her page. The aisle of a first-class cabin is not a long distance by any objective measurement, perhaps 30 feet from row 1 to the aircraft door, and Warren Holt covered it in something less than a minute. But it was the kind of minute that expands, that contains more time inside it than a minute is supposed to hold. He collected his Louis Vuitton carry-on from the overhead bin, without looking at anything other than the handle. He felt the weight of it, the expensive leather, the monogram, the hardware, and it felt like the heaviest thing he had ever carried, not because it was heavy, but because he could not find in this moment what it was supposed to mean. Dr. Franklin Webb in 2A had not put his phone down. The woman in 3A looked away when Warren passed her row, which was worse than being looked at. And at the galley entrance, Denise was standing not in his way, not performing anything, just present her hands clasped behind her back. Her posture straight in the specific way that belongs to people who have decided in this exact moment not to make themselves smaller. And she looked at Warren Holt directly and said in a voice that was even and quiet and completely devoid of malice, "Have a safe evening, Mr. Holt." Warren did not respond. He stepped through the aircraft door onto the jet bridge, and the cool air of the terminal hit him, and he straightened his tie by reflex, which was an absurd thing to do under the circumstances, but his hands needed something to do. And then he saw them. 4 Port Authority officers at the end of the jet bridge. Not TSA agents, not gate staff, but officers in tactical vests, standing with the practiced stillness of people who are accustomed to waiting for moments, exactly like this one. Warren Holt, the lead officer, said. "Yes," Warren said, and squared his shoulders, and the officer behind the leader was already reaching for the zip ties on his belt. The holding cell at the Port Authority Police Department's JFK facility was a room designed with a very specific purpose, which was to remove a person from every context in which they had previously understood themselves and leave them with only themselves and 4 walls, and it accomplished this purpose with remarkable efficiency because the walls were a shade of institutional beige that seemed chosen specifically to deny the eye anything to rest on, and the fluorescent light above buzzed with a frequency that felt like the sound of time passing too slowly, and the metal bench was bolted to the floor at a height that was just slightly too low for comfort, and the stainless steel toilet in the corner confirmed without saying anything that Warren Holt was now in a category of person he had never imagined occupying. He had been there for 2 hours when the door buzzed open, and a woman walked in, wearing a navy suit and carrying a government-issue tablet with the specific efficiency of movement that suggests the person has somewhere more important to be. FBI agent Patricia Wynn, Joint Terrorism Task Force, introduced herself without offering a hand, sat across from Warren on the metal chair, and explained that interfering with a flight crew fell under federal jurisdiction, which was why the FBI was involved rather than the local district. And then she turned the tablet around and set it on the table between them. The video had 9 million views. Warren watched himself, face purple veins visible at his temples. Finger pointed at a woman who was not moving, not flinching, not raising her voice, and it was like watching someone he had never met, except that the suit was his suit, and the words were his words. And the face, when he forced himself to look at it directly, was unmistakably his face, and the quality of the watching was like pressing a bruise. Then Agent Wynn swiped to the stock ticker for Holt Meridian Capital. The line went in one direction only. The Asian markets opened 40 minutes after the video went viral, she said without inflection, as though she were reading a weather report. Your stock is down 19%. The sovereign wealth fund out of Qatar has already issued a statement. She paused. And the California State Pension Fund called for an emergency board meeting which was held via video call approximately 1 hour ago. Warren looked at the number on the screen. 19%. He had worked 17 years to build that company to the point where a 19% drop represented a number large enough to alter the financial architecture of a human life, and it had taken 30 minutes of an airplane aisle to produce it. There's something else, Agent Wynn said, and swiped again. And what appeared on the screen was a press release from the FAA announcing the opening of a formal investigation into Holt Meridian Capital's private jet usage, specifically regarding flight log irregularities and undeclared asset movements identified by the International Civil Aviation Oversight Board. Warren was quiet for a long time. She remembered he said finally more to himself than to Wynn. Agent Wynn closed the tablet cover. Dr. Beaumont sees every manifest, every fuel log, and every pilot certification file that crosses through her board, she said. You weren't yelling at a random passenger, Mr. Holt. You were yelling at the person who has been looking at your paperwork for the past 3 years. Warren's corporate attorney, a man named Douglas Finch, who had been billing Holt Meridian Capital at $420 an hour for the past 8 years, was not available to represent Warren, personally, a distinction that Finch communicated through Agent Wynn rather than directly, which told Warren something important about where he stood before a single word of the explanation had been delivered. Finch was reviewing Warren's employment contract, Wynn explained, on behalf of the board. The board had held an emergency session, the second, in 2 hours, following the first, which had addressed the stock situation, and had voted to invoke the moral turpitude clause in Warren's executive contract, which meant they were suing him for breach of fiduciary duty and seeking to recover damages from his equity stake, which was the primary mechanism by which Warren's personal wealth was tied to the company he had spent 17 years building. The assets were frozen pending the outcome of the suit. The company car was to be returned by morning, or it would be reported stolen. The penthouse apartment, which Warren had always thought of as his, but which had, on closer inspection of the documents, always been owned by the company, was having its locks changed within the hour. Agent Wynn delivered all of this in the same tone she had used for the stock price and the FAA investigation, which was the tone of someone who is not enjoying delivering bad news, but is not enjoying it either. Warren asked to make a personal call, and Wynn indicated the wall phone, and Warren called his wife, Barbara, who picked up on the first ring in the way people pick up when they have been waiting for a call and have already decided what they are going to say. Barbara had seen the video. She told Warren, watched the part where he told the flight attendant he needed a seatmate who was compatible for the atmosphere, and she had found that particular combination of words very revealing. And she was staying at her sister's in Connecticut, and she would be speaking to her attorney in the morning, and she was freezing the joint accounts tonight, and she did not want him to call her again. The line went dead. Warren sat with the receiver against his ear for a moment after the call ended, listening to the dial tone, which was the loneliest sound he had heard in many years. And then he made one more call to his oldest friend and former college roommate, a man named Edward, who had been his business partner in the early years, and who picked up, listened to 30 seconds of Warren's explanation, and said with genuine sadness and no hesitation, "Don't call me again, Warren. Not until this is resolved. My partners are watching." And then Edward was gone too, and Warren was alone in the holding cell, with the buzzing light and the metal bench and the slow, enormous weight of everything he had set in motion in one 30-minute stretch of a first-class aisle. Queens County Criminal Court in the early morning has a quality that is different from any other hour of any other courthouse, a kind of stripped-down reality that comes from the fact that the people in it, at this hour, are there not because they have chosen to be, but because the law has placed them there. And there is a particular democracy to this, a brutal equal opportunity removal of whatever story a person had been telling about themselves before the evening began. Warren was led in wearing his bespoke suit, which was now wrinkled in ways it had never been wrinkled before, without cufflinks, because the officers had taken them at intake, and he was assigned to the defense table, where a young public defender named Simon Katz was waiting with a heavy file and the honest, tired face of someone who has been given a complicated problem at 6 in the morning. Warren asked for Douglas Finch. Simon told him Finch's firm had cited a conflict of interest. Warren listed 3 other firms. Simon told him all 3 had declined. The gallery behind them was already more full than a Sunday morning arraignment had any right to be press badges, camera rigs. The organized energy of a story that had already been running for 8 hours and was still accelerating. All rise. Judge Harriet Lowe entered, wearing her robes the way certain people wear authority, not as a costume, but as a continuation of themselves. And she was a woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair cut very short, and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a face that had seen enough in 30 years on the bench to have developed a very efficient internal process for separating what mattered from what didn't. And Warren looked at her and did not recognize her, which was not surprising because Warren rarely remembered the names or faces of people who had been on the wrong side of his business decisions. And 10 years ago, one of those decisions had been the aggressive acquisition and tenant clearing of a low-income housing complex in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and Judge Harriet Lowe's older sister had been one of the 200 families displaced. Judge Lowe had never disclosed this connection. She would not disclose it today. Her ruling would be supported entirely and unimpeachably by law. She reviewed the docket. She looked at Warren Holt with a professional blankness that contained everything and revealed nothing. The charges: federal interference with flight crew under 49 U.S.C. Section 46,504, disorderly conduct and hate speech harassment under the airport safety statutes, passed 18 months prior. The DA presented the video, the voicemail Warren had left on Gerald Ashworth's, Line 9 witness statements from first-class passengers, and the information that federal agents executing a warrant on Warren's luggage had found documentation of the undeclared asset transfers the ICAOB had flagged, including bearer bonds and title documents for art holdings routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Warren's domestic accounts had been frozen at 8 that morning by joint order of the IRS and SEC. The penthouse was no longer his. His wife had retained counsel. His company had terminated him. Judge Lowe looked at him over her reading glasses with the steady, unperformative calm of someone who has watched this particular species of collapse many times and finds it neither surprising nor satisfying, just real. She set bail at $4 million cash or bond, noting that the defendant's overseas assets, dual citizenship, and now frozen domestic accounts made him a significant flight risk, and that his access to private aviation, which he had attempted to use the previous evening to charter an alternate flight to London after being removed from the Royal Atlantic. Flight confirmed this assessment. The assets were frozen. There was no bond. Warren was remanded. He stood as the gavel came down and said to the courtroom, and no one in particular, in a voice that was smaller than any voice he had used in 30 years of professional life, "Do you know who I am?" The courtroom moved on. The reporters filed out. The next case was called. The world continued at its normal pace, which is to say it did not pause for Warren Holt. And this specific indifference of time was the beginning of the truest consequence, the one no court had ordered, but that had arrived nonetheless. JFK International Airport. At 9:45 on a Tuesday evening has a particular quality of light. The fluorescent overheads doing their flat, merciless work on every surface. The terminal half empty, in the way that airports are half empty after the dinner rush, but before the midnight departures, with a scattered population of delayed passengers and airport staff, and the kind of weary travelers who are at that specific point in a long journey where they have stopped looking like people going somewhere and started looking like people simply enduring the distance between two places. A man in an industrial Navy jumpsuit moved through the Terminal 7 corridor, pushing a gray utility cart. And if you had seen him from a distance, you would have seen the cart first. The yellow caution cone on top, the mop handle extending up at an angle, the cleaning supply bottles lined in their little holsters, and only then the man behind it, which was how it was supposed to work, which was the point of a uniform like that, to make the person wearing it part of the infrastructure, rather than an individual moving through it. The name tag on his chest said, Warren. His plea deal had been what his court-appointed attorney called a mercy, which was the attorney's way of acknowledging that the evidence was comprehensive and the jury pool was a problem, and the wisest path was to avoid one entirely 3 years of supervised release, mandatory anger management therapy twice a week, 500 hours of community service to be served at JFK International Airport, assigned to the janitorial contractor that held the Terminal 7 cleaning contract, and that had a long-standing arrangement with the court to employ high-profile offenders because of the tax implications. The work was straightforward, clean, the surfaces empty. The bins respond when spoken to. Do not make yourself remarkable in any way. Warren had discovered in the first week that this last instruction was the hardest, not because he wanted to be recognized, but because anonymity was a practice like a muscle, and he had spent 57 years developing the opposite of it, and the relearning was slow and physical in a way he had not expected. Holt Meridian Capital had been acquired by a competitor at a distressed valuation 6 weeks after his arrest, and Warren's equity frozen, claimed applied against the damages judgment had yielded him nothing. The divorce had been finalized 4 months ago, and the settlement had left him the Honda Civic. A studio apartment in a part of Queens he used to fly over in a helicopter, and a joint bank account that now held slightly less than $3,000, because Barbara's attorneys had been very thorough, and because Warren's attorneys had cost a great deal of the money he'd had before the accounts were frozen, which was a compounding problem of his own architecture. His supervisor, a 26-year-old named Sal, who wore his authority lightly over everyone except Warren, for whom he seemed to reserve a particular savoring quality, told him to get the first-class corridor spotless before 10 o'clock, because there was a VIP movement coming through, and Warren said, "Yes, sir," without inflection, and pushed his cart toward the corridor past the gate where his flight had been scheduled to depart 6 months ago, past the boarding desk, where a different set of agents now stood past every marker of the evening that had ended his life as he had understood it. He sprayed glass cleaner on the partition between the corridor and the first-class lounge, and began to wipe the smell of ammonia, sharp and clean, and through the glass he could see the passengers in the lounge, a man sipping whiskey. Neat, a woman typing rapidly on a laptop, the ordinary, unexamined luxury of people who had not yet considered how quickly the floor could disappear, and Warren cleaned the glass until it was clear, because that was what he was here to do. He heard the change before he saw it, the way the corridor's ambient sound shifted when TSA redirected the regular foot traffic, a subtle drop in the background noise that created a different quality of space. And then the gold scarf concierge came rapid walking from the direction of the international arrivals area, with her radio in one hand and the expression of someone who has been told that something important is happening and is responsible for ensuring that the environment in which it happens is appropriately curated. Warren kept cleaning. He had learned that the correct response to VIP movements in this corridor was to become as invisible as possible, which meant continuing the task at hand without looking up, without slowing, without doing anything that might cause someone to focus on the person holding the cleaning cloth rather than on the VIP being moved through. The double doors at the far end of the corridor opened, and a formation of security personnel entered. 4 of them, dark suits, moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who do this regularly and well, and behind them, a group of aides and assistants moving in the practiced orbit of someone who generates this kind of forward momentum wherever she goes. And in the center of this formation, walking with the unhurried authority of someone who has long since stopped being impressed by the scale of the rooms she enters, was Dr. Claudette Beaumont. She wore a cream-colored wool suit, and her braids were pinned into an intricate crown, and she was reviewing something on a tablet, while an aide walked backward in front of her, maintaining eye contact, delivering information, and she was answering questions and issuing directions without breaking stride, and the quality of her attention was divided between the tablet and the conversation in the specific way that belongs to people who are always doing 2 things at once, because one thing is never quite enough to occupy them. Warren's hand stopped moving on the glass. He registered in the involuntary way the body registers things before the mind gives permission that she was moving toward him through the corridor, that the formation would pass within 10 feet of where he was standing, and he pressed himself slightly toward the partition and kept his face angled at the glass, and breathed very carefully the way you breathe when you are trying to take up less space than your body actually occupies. 8 feet, 6 feet. He did not look up. One of the aides dropped a stylus. It clattered on the polished terrazzo floor and skittered a short distance toward the partition, and the aide made an apologetic sound and bent to retrieve it, and the formation paused for exactly 2 seconds, which was the amount of time required to pick up a stylus, and during those 2 seconds, the quality of movement in the corridor changed, and Warren felt the way you feel a change in pressure before you feel the weather that something had shifted. He turned his head. He could not stop himself from turning his head. It was the specific gravity of a moment that the body recognizes before the mind has caught up with it, and his eyes moved of their own accord, and they met hers. Claudette Beaumont looked at him. She looked at his face. First, the lines in it that had deepened the gray of it, the quality of exhaustion that is different from tiredness and different from sadness, that particular flatness that comes from having had the story you told about yourself taken away and not yet found another one, and then at the jumpsuit, and then at the name tag that said Warren in plain block letters with no surname beneath it, because surnames were not part of the uniform. Warren stood completely still. He was aware with the full and comprehensive awareness of a man who has nothing left to lose, that he was bracing for the final thing, the last reduction, the moment when she pointed him out to her entourage, or said something to the aide, or simply allowed recognition to become visible on her face, in a way that would require him to stand here in his navy jumpsuit and receive it without the ability to leave. And he was aware that there was nothing inside him left with which to absorb it, that whatever resources he had once brought to the management of his self-regard had been exhausted in the preceding 6 months, and that what would be left after this moment was something he had not yet found a name for. Claudette Beaumont looked at him for one full breath. Her expression did not change, not a smirk, not a flinch, not the controlled suppression of emotion that reads as its own kind of reaction. Her face simply continued, as it was calm, focused the face of a person already thinking about the next thing. And in the quality of that non-response, Warren understood something that surprised him with its clarity. She had assessed what was in front of her and found it insufficient to constitute an event. He was not an enemy to be concluded. He was not a triumph to be acknowledged. He was not in this moment anything that required a response from her. He was part of the corridor. The aide retrieved the stylus and straightened and said, "Everything all right, Dr. Beaumont?" She looked forward. "Everything's fine," she said. Her voice smooth and untroubled. "The windows are quite clean." She nodded toward the partition, a brief and genuine acknowledgement of a job done well, directed at no one in particular, which was somehow worse than contempt and better than pity and more honest than anything else that had happened in this corridor in 6 months. Her heels struck the terrazzo as she resumed walking. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound of the world continuing. The formation swept past, and in their wake, the air that settled back into the corridor smelled faintly of something expensive, and light the ghost of a perfume that had nothing to do with ammonia, and Warren stood with his hand still pressed against the glass partition and watched them reach the gate, watched the agents bow their heads respectfully as she approached, watched the jet bridge door open and receive her and close again, sealing her into the world of champagne and legroom and the 54 nations waiting for her signature. He did not move for a long time. When he finally became aware of himself again, of the cloth in his hand, the cart beside him, the hum of the terminal, he found that his face was wet, and he reached up and touched his cheek, and his fingers came away with the evidence of something he had not cried since he was 8 years old, in a life so different from the one he currently occupied that it felt like information about a stranger. He was not crying because she had humiliated him. She had not. He was crying because she had done something much more complete than that she had simply moved through the space where he was standing without letting him matter, and in that indifference he had understood fully, and without any remaining capacity for self-deception, that she had not destroyed him. She had made one phone call and returned to her document, and he had destroyed himself against his own reflection over 30 minutes in an airplane aisle because he could not tolerate the existence of a woman whose accomplishments exceeded his and whose skin was a different color than his. And those two facts had been the entire architecture of his collapse. Warren Sal's voice came from down the corridor, sharp and bored. "Men's room near gate 9. Someone got sick. It's a situation." Warren Holt looked at the closed gate one last time. He looked at the dark window of the terminal, at the lights of the tarmac beyond it, at the massive silver plane preparing to climb into the sky he had once believed belonged to him. He gripped the handle of his cart. He turned it around. The wheels squeaked against the polished floor, a high, thin, honest sound, and he pushed it away from the light, his shoulders down his head, forward, disappearing into the ordinary, indifferent crowd of the terminal. A ghost in the kingdom he had burned. Somewhere over the Atlantic at 35,000 feet, Dr. Claudette Beaumont adjusted her reading light, opened the London Accords to the page she had bookmarked 6 months ago, and continued exactly where she had left off the work her father had never been allowed to do, carried forward in the only way she knew how at altitude, in the clean and impartial dark, above the clouds, where the sky asked nothing about the color of the person moving through it. In the pages of the Accords, buried in the dedication section, that most delegates would skim, and a few would read, and 1 or 2 might remember, was a single line. For James Beaumont, who knew the sky was his, and was right. The document would be signed the following morning by 54 nations. The behavior Warren Holt had displayed in that first-class cabin would be reclassified within its binding framework, from a passenger preference dispute to a federal safety violation, a change that would quietly protect thousands of people who traveled in spaces where they were not expected. At Gate B-14, the last flight of the night lifted off into the dark, And Warren Holt watched it rise through the glass. He had just cleaned his breath, briefly fogging the surface. And then the plane was gone, swallowed by a sky that did not know his name, and the terminal moved on around him indifferent and continuous, the way the world moves on, the way it had always moved on for people who are no longer the center of anything. If this story stayed with you, please like and share it, and subscribe to our channel for more.